moment to Maccabees and Margaritas. Cheers.
I've told you you're going to have to carry the margarita department. That's not my thing, I'm afraid, but I'm happy to be here.
How about this? How about you carry the theology and I'll carry the drinking?
You know, I think I used to have on my Twitter profile that I haven't found an orthodoxy that doesn't hate me. So asking me to carry the theology is a dangerous proposition. I don't think you want to do that.
It's a calculated risk.
Either way, though, I'm happy to do it. I can. So you asked that before we actually get started on the reading that I share a little bit as far as my understanding of the background of these things. So when I was thinking about it the past couple of days, a couple of things came to mind. We hopefully are going to have different people from a whole lot of different backgrounds watching this thing.
Yeah.
And you know, I know in the moment being right often feels like the most important thing ever, but especially when it comes to things that are religious, things that are theological, that we hold close. But I remember hearing a story about a guy in Protestant New England 150 years ago who decided eventually that he couldn't take communion with his own wife because she was wrong on her doctrine. And I would note that every single one of us is going to die believing things that are wrong with our doctrine. None of us is going to get it right. And Jesus never actually condemned that. He didn't actually seem to have a huge issue with that. So I think that first we need to say, we're exploring this thing. We're looking through it. We have our beliefs. We'll interpret it through our beliefs, but we're interested in what it has to say. And we don't intend to throw shade on anybody else's beliefs. And we don't intend to, you know, how do I put it? We don't want to belittle what anybody else thinks, but at the same time, what you and I take out of it, what the Spirit says to us, we're going to share that. Seem fair? Okay,
well
so
said.
Thank you. So then the next thing is there are multiple times in the New Testament we're told to test the spirits. We're told to look at what even Paul said, look at what he's saying and to test it to make sure it's true. And so the Apocrypha, generally understood, are writings that kind of come alongside the biblical canon. And they're important, but they're not on the same level of scripture. And there are kind of three types of extra biblical writing. The first there's stuff that's mostly just historical. It may have some doctrinal stuff in it, like I know Maccabees has some, but it's mostly a history. And it's history that I don't know.
Yeah, same.
Okay. Then second, there's stuff that's well-intended and probably even has God speaking through it some, but it doesn't fall on the same level as biblical canon in terms of reliability. So stuff like the Book of Enoch would fall into this category, right? And then third, there's stuff that was actually intended to mislead people from the beginning. And I'm not pointing at anything specific in the commonly understood stuff, but just as an example, the other day, my friend said he happened upon the Essene Book of Revelation, and he thought it was the coolest thing ever. And so I went and I listened to the Essene Book of Revelation, and let me tell you, it is not the coolest thing ever. In fact, it's really not very good. It's very Gnostic, and it takes some pretty serious discernment to find anything in there that isn't almost, I would say, almost channeled by demons. It's that bad. So there are things that are intended to deceive, and that's what our discernment is for. And you know, you match things against the rest of the Bible to see if they fit, because God does not have any contradiction in himself, and we know that. So that's what I know of the Apocrypha. That's my understanding of the whole thing. And you know, sometime I'd love to talk about how inspiration works, but that's kind of another whole subject. But either way, that's sort of what we're getting into here. We're reading something that the Protestant Bible holds as Apocrypha. It was included in King James Bibles clear up into the 1660 somethings. And Catholics still have it in their canon. So, we don't know exactly what's in there. You and I don't, but
Yeah,
it should be interesting.
exactly. I think an interesting thing, not that we consider this, religion to be a true religion, but Jehovah's Witnesses, from that perspective, they are very against the Book of Maccabees, and they view it as demonic and something that shouldn't be read.
Interesting. Well, yeah. Okay. So my uncle
Mm-hmm.
grew up Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and when I told him what we were planning on doing, he had a similar impression where when he started to read it, the Spirit kind of told him this isn't really great for you. But that was when he was a very young Christian. So,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I've never opened it up. Never. So,
Same.
yeah.
It will definitely be interesting. Would you like to say a prayer that God's discernment be upon us?
Absolutely. Thank you. Father, thank you for the opportunity to do this with Freda and for the people who are watching today, that we all get to hang out together and look through this. Please give us all of us, discernment and understanding. Help us to see what there is there for us to find for truth. And if there's anything that we should be careful of, if there's anything that is not of you, please help us to see it. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that. I think that gives us
Absolutely.
a real solid foundation to start. Oh, we have some people in chat that have their own hard copies. Look at you. Way to go. So anybody who does need the link, it's in chat. We're using it, the Bible Gateway, the Good News translation, for just in case there are any translational differences. That is the version that we're currently using.
Yeah, and I got to be honest, I don't know anything about which translations are best for Maccabees or anything else. I'm sure that there's
Yeah,
plenty to ask about it, but got to start somewhere.
exactly. I also know that because of the fact that it is both a Catholics and individuals in Judaism do
Mhm.
claim the book both for themselves, that finding, like, if you're reading through like your usual version of the Bible may not have it included. For instance, I use the English Standard Version
Yeah.
and it wasn't in there. So that's why we're kind of stepping outside of some norms to look into this.
hmm
So would you like me to start reading first, or would you like to start?
Absolutely, go for it. I got to
Okay.
talk first. You go ahead.
Okay. Awesome. Making sure that the microphone comes with me because I'm gonna be reading it off of my laptop here. Okay. This history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius, king of Persia and Media. Alexander enlarged the Greek Empire by defeating Darius. Is it Darius or Darius?
It's generally it's Darius, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
In seizing his throne, he fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put the kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations, and when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant. By building up a strong army, he dominated whole nations and their rulers, and forced everyone to pay him taxes. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and he divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, the generals took control, and each had himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. So I think it might be a good idea for us to stop at like the bolded headlines.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so far the background on this seems to check out. The whole brought a great deal of misery on the world definitely shows something of a Jewish perspective there. I'm sure
Yes.
there are people who would laud what Alexander did, but other than that, it seems relatively historically correct.
Yeah, from My husband is a huge history buff, and from the things that he's told me, because he likes like the ancient history as well, specifically. He likes that one and like World War II. And so with the stuff that he's told me about the ancient history in this respect, it lines up, as has like the general public school understanding of history.
Well, and I was homeschooled all the way through, and it lines up with mine too. So
okay, cool. So Antioch
Antiochus Epiphanes
and the Renegade Jews. I was not prepared for names to be this hard. Of course, it's something semi-Jewish.
I'm afraid. Well, I'm afraid it's just going to be like this the whole way through, though. There isn't much to do about it.
As long as nobody in chat gets mad at me for mispronouncing things.
I think you're good.
Okay. Do you want to read the next like little bit?
Sure.
And then okay, cool.
Okay. The wicked ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus III of Syria, was a descendant of one of Alexander's generals. Antiochus Epiphanes had been a hostage in Rome before he became king of Syria in the year 137. At that time, there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, "Let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble." This proposal appealed to many people, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received from him permission to follow Gentile customs. They built in Jerusalem a stadium like those in the Greek cities. They had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant, started associating with Gentiles, and did all sorts of other evil things.
So from my understanding of history, I know that a lot of the things that happened in those Greek stadiums were like fights with lions and each like people like killing each other and stuff, right?
That was under Rome, I know. Under the Greek rulership, I don't know what actually went on. I know the Greeks built those things and they started a lot of the different customs, but I don't know what actually was custom in those stadia under the Greeks.
But but at least from what we do know, we can kind of discern that they probably weren't doing the greatest things.
Well, and here's another thought. Something I know about the modern church that most people don't know is that the idea of a single pastor standing in the place of honor and speaking to everyone else was an idea that came from Greek culture, not from Hebrew culture. In the Hebrew culture, it was more like, well, if you look at what Jesus did when he was young, like in the Gospels, it talks about him speaking in the synagogue and whatever. That was a place where they gathered together and different people would speak. And if Jesus was allowed to speak, can you imagine somebody doing that in a church today who is like a 14-year-old getting up during the sermon or something? That it's a totally different culture. And so I think that one of the things that this might be pointing out is a stadium requires someone to be standing sort of in the place where the sound is designed to emanate from, because they used natural forms of the building to bring the sound to the different seats. And so maybe one of the things we could take away from this is that the normal Jewish custom of getting together and everybody being able to have their different input whenever it was appropriate was sort of given up for this Greek thing where you had one person who was sort of speaking and in charge at any given time. Just a thought.
That's a really interesting takeaway.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
That was just what came to me when I read it.
In verse 15, I don't want to dwell here, but I find it interesting that even back then they kind of had what basically sounds like today is genital mutilation or
We humans have this weird thing with screwing up our bodies, and we always have. It's just it's just kind of a human thing. It seems like the
yeah.
closer to God people get, uh, the less they sort of desire to do that, and the further from God they are, the more they desire to do that.
Yeah, like even in the Bible, how it told us that we couldn't basically like make carvings like into our flesh and
Mm-hmm.
like cut ourselves up and stuff.
Yeah,
So I don't know. I find that very interesting.
it is. You wanna read the next bit?
Yeah. So when Antiochus had firmly established himself as king, he decided to conquer Egypt and rule that country as well as Syria. He invaded Egypt with a large fleet of ships and a powerful army, including chariots, elephants, and cavalry. When the attack came, King Ptolemy of Egypt turned and fled, and many of his soldiers were killed. Antiochus was able to capture the fortified cities of Egypt and plunder the whole land.
Again, pretty much just history here.
Yeah.
And I had a general interest in history, but nothing that ever gave me anything specific from this era. And I get the idea that a lot of what we understand about this era comes from sources sort of like this. It's like Josephus or whatever. The Jewish historians and the histories and such are some of our better preserved records of such things.
Yeah, I wonder if part of that has to do with how lineage has always played a big part, especially because, at least from my understanding, because I do have some Jewish family members, the
Mm-hmm.
way like the Jewish family line is, it goes through the mother. So because of that, I wonder how much of their ability to really capture history, even from ancient times, and preserve it to today has to do with lineages.
I don't know. I know that they have lineages from the matrilineal and the patrilineal in some places because we have Jesus's father and mother. We have both
Yeah.
of them represented in the Bible. So, but the genealogies have never particularly interested me, and it's not something I've spent a whole lot of time understanding. I certainly don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, I don't either. It was always when I was a kid reading the Bible, it kind of was something that I'm not proud to admit this, but I kind of just skimmed and I'm like, okay, so they had babies and they had babies. Okay, let's get to the
Frida,
good stuff.
Frida, I don't think there's any kid who would. Well, I shouldn't say that because I've met a few people who would be interested, but 99% of kids are in the same boat you are, and I was too.
Um, well, it's good to know at least we're all in the boat together. I do find it interesting in verse 17
Mm-hmm.
that they used elephants. I think that's really cool that they used them back then because with the lack of what's it called when you like build up like cities and stuff versus I forget. But basically,
The fortification?
thank you.
Yeah,
See,
no worries.
yet another reason I picked you to do this project with me. Um,
I'm going to be doing the same thing to you. I'm going to go, what's the word? You know the word. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Anyway,
so with elephants, because of the fact that they can actually carry a ton because of their strength and because of their strength to weight ratio, which is really cool.
yeah, I know that they were a war animal at one time. I know that certain certain kings made great use of them, but that's all I know.
Yeah.
It's always like Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants is the one that everybody thinks of. I know.
I honestly didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Shall I? Let's see.
Yes.
Okay, here we are.
Okay.
Antiochus persecutes the Jews. In the year 143, after the conquest of Egypt, Antiochus marched with a great army against the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. In his arrogance, he entered the temple and took away the gold altar, the lampstand with all its equipment, the table for the bread offered to the Lord, the cups and bowls, the gold fire pans, the curtain, and the crowns. He also stripped all the gold from the front of the temple and carried off the silver and gold and everything else of value, including all the treasures that he could find stored there. Then he took it all to his own country. He had also murdered many people and boasted arrogantly about it. There was great mourning everywhere in the land of Israel. I'm going to hold up there.
Yeah.
It occurs to me early on in this, like in the first or second paragraph, it talks about how the descendants of Alexander caused the peoples of the earth great misery. I think here we're seeing where that came from.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Especially because the things that were stored in the temple had that like very spiritual significance and likely emotional significance as well, where they were things of great, pride and great honor.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So that would definitely be like hitting them where it probably hurt the most as far as like their culture and their religion and everything went.
I'll tell you what, I'll read the next verses and then you go ahead and start after that.
Okay.
So, rulers and leaders groaned in sorrow. Young men and young women grew weak. The beauty of our woman faded. Every bridegroom sang a funeral song, and every bride sat mourning in her room. All our people were clothed with shame, and our land trembled for them. Interesting.
You can just like feel the despair as you're reading that.
You can, and some of this makes me want to bring in some of what Michael Heiser has to say about cosmic geography. And I know I've talked to you about Heiser. Heiser has looked at the Old Testament and brought out some things that a lot of people don't normally encounter. He's got some cool seminars. He passed away just earlier this year, actually. But one of the things he has to say is that back in those times, people looked at their worship as being very geographically bounded. And Heiser points to Deuteronomy, where it says that the nations were divided up according to the number of the sons of God. And so the idea is that different beings were given dominion over different nations. And so if all of the holy objects of Israel and all of their things of spiritual significance were dragged off to another country, that would be a really traumatic thing. Yeah. Another God got a hold of God's holy objects. Oh my gosh, it's an interesting way to think of it, because to us, that doesn't mean nearly the same thing,
Yeah. I mean, it really doesn't, because the only thing I can kind of think of there's things that I can think of that are like modern day-ish versions, but they don't even come close to the despair. Like when some little punk kid, steals like the altar around Christmas time, like with like Jewish and like, oh my God, Jesus, not Jewish. With Jesus in the manger, that does not have nearly as much of an effect, even though that's obviously something people are sad about. That's nowhere near. And we don't really have a modern day equivalency of that.
I kind of think that that's sort of a result of, he said he'd write his laws on our hearts. And I think one of the things that he impresses on us is that the objects are way less important than the substance of his being. And that's like 2,000 years that's been ingrained into the church. And so at the time, they didn't have that. The reverence placed upon objects in most cultures is much higher. Anyway, yeah.
No, that's a really interesting and solid point. And I wonder if, because of what God had done for Israel when they, traveled and everything and they fought all of these battles, and God delivered all of these nations onto them, and allowed his people to come out on top and win in, you know, all of the battles with his, you know, guidance and fortification and stuff. I wonder if the fact that they say that, where is it? And all our people were clothed with shame, and our land trembled for them. If they were like kind of finally at this like milk and honey land, and they had like made like settlements there and stuff, if this was kind of generationally new for them. But I'm bad at like timelines, so does that
Well,
make
this
sense?
was, yeah, it does. You know, this was, I don't know where this was compared to, yeah, the timeline on this is a little hard for me. I know this is in the years before Christ. You know, this is the Greek Empire immediately preceded the Roman Empire. So this was in the years, I think it was in what they call the period of silence, which was between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's the impression I get.
Oh, I just realized that if you click on the footnotes, so it says, sorry, I was like trying to see if it was a thing.
Yeah.
The dates in this book are counted from the beginning of the Syrian kingdom in 312 BC. The year
So yeah.
137 corresponds to 175 BC.
Okay, so that's right. That's right then. It was during the period of silence. It was during the time after the prophets of the Old Testament, and in the time, in the couple of hundred years before Christ, that this is going on. Cool.
So I'm glad we kind of have a
Yeah. Okay, you want to go on with the next part, or is there anything else on this one?
I think that John in the comments makes a really good point. Sorry, not comments, chat.
Yeah.
I have to get my streamer vocab right, or my husband will make fun of me later. Where he says stuff becomes idols real fast, and that's so true.
Yeah. It does. Well, and it, you know, along those lines, it had even more sort of tendency to do that back then. And that's sort of what I was getting at when I was talking about how today we have a lot less reverence for objects. It's because the way we think about things has shifted some over the past couple of thousand years, and it was even more so then. Yeah, absolutely right.
Also, just as a side note to chat and anybody watching now or later, definitely check out Michael Heiser. Jared was the one who got me in like looking at his stuff, and it's really fascinating and really interesting with some crucial takeaways for all of us today. So make sure you check that stuff out. I think I'll later on, Jared and I will try to tweet some of the links out for you guys.
Absolutely. I know his seminar and stuff. My little brother actually introduced me to it, and the cool thing about it is he goes straight to scripture as his source material. He doesn't take a lot. He takes a little bit from extra biblical sources, but mostly it's straight from scripture. And what he has to say is really interesting.
That's one of the reasons I liked him so much. So thanks for that recommendation.
Absolutely. You know, trying to help people to find things that give them another bit of truth here or there is so important.
It really is. Now, are we at chapter? No, not chapter. Verse 29?
Yep, that's right.
2 years later, Antiochus sent a large army from Mysia against the towns of Judea. When the soldiers entered Jerusalem, their commander spoke to the people, offering them terms of peace and completely deceiving them. Then he suddenly launched a fierce attack on the city, dealing it a major blow and killing many of the people. He plundered the city, set it on fire, and tore down its buildings and walls. He and his army took the women and children as prisoners and seized the cattle. Do you want me to keep reading?
I don't know. The one comment I would make there is if it doesn't mention the men, that probably means he killed most of them, because that was the common practice then.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I didn't have anything specific
Okay.
there.
Just because the way it's like broken up now is a little bit,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's all right.
Okay.
That's all right. Just whatever seems good.
Then Antiochus and his forces built high walls and strong towers in the area north of the temple, turning it into a fort. Sorry, I just pictured in my mind's eye, because I'm a very visual person. I just pictured these guys like having killed everybody and doing all of this horrible stuff, and then just building a fort. You know, boys being boys. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make light of this.
No. You're good. You're good.
Um,
Okay.
they brought in a group of traitorous Jews and installed them there. They also brought in arms and supplies and stored in the fort all the loot that they had taken in Jerusalem. This fort became a great threat to the city.
Huh. Interesting.
And then it goes on to talk about why the fort was such a threat.
Yep. Yeah. No, I mean, again, it makes sense to me. Shall we just continue?
Yeah.
You want me to go?
Okay, yeah, that works.
Sure. The fort was a threat to the temple, a constant evil menace for Israel. Innocent people were murdered around the altar. The holy place was defiled by murderers. The people of Jerusalem fled in fear, and the city became a colony of foreigners. Jerusalem was foreign to its own people, who had been forced to abandon the city. Her temple was as empty as a wilderness. Her festivals were turned into days of mourning, her Sabbath joy into shame. Her honor became an object of ridicule. Her shame was as great as her former glory, and her pride was turned into deepest mourning. Yeah, I,
Yeah.
I don't even know what to say. I mean, it's.
Yeah. Do you think that, honestly, you don't have to have an answer for this question? I'm probably going to end up answering a lot of like asking like a lot of rhetorical questions. But do you
That's
think
fine.
that God let this happen to his people because of the fact that they were doing all of that stuff and like leaning into like the Gentile practices and following like it talked about earlier and like their evil ways?
You know, I'm sort of two minds on this. Number one, there's the place in one of the gospels where Jesus says that this man did not come to the end he did because of anything that his parents did. He did it so the glory of God could be shown. So there's always that.
Yeah.
But one of the principles that God operates under is as you sow, so shall you reap.
Mm-hmm.
And so usually when you have something like this happening, it's because the people were doing stuff that was really not good.
Yeah.
So by the principles of the thing, I would say probably it was because they were doing things that weren't good, and that's kind of Israel's history: is do things that aren't good, find out how bad an idea that was. That's over and over again.
Yeah. Fafo is
But
definitely a vibe with them.
well, and so no, I think. I mean, I think you're right. I think that's probably what it is, but do I know that for sure? No, I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, that's why I said like kind of just a conversational / rhetorical question where we're
Yeah,
not
no.
saying like this is exactly what it is kind of thing, but just talking about it as a theory.
Yep. No, absolutely. And John just agreed, and he's right. That's how it goes.
Yes.
Okay, so let's see. Antiochus now issued a decree that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. All the Gentiles and even many of the Israelites submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion, offered sacrifices to idols, and no longer observed the Sabbath. That's something we see over and over again too.
Yeah.
It seems like any time a culture starts to turn away from God, you have the same set of things happen. It's like they turn away from God, they wander away to some other religion,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's in our case science or wokeism or whatever, or they offer sacrifices to idols. So whether that's an actual sacrifice to an idol or doing something in your life that is idolatry,
Mm.
that is putting something else before God, and they no longer observe the Sabbath. And it seems like that's a key indicator. It's not necessarily a cause, but it's an indicator.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So,
I really like what Nancy said here. In the Old Testament, God often used such actions to punish the people to try and turn them around. Indeed, that is the ongoing theme of the Old Testament. And I wonder how
yeah.
much of it is generational memory, because I've been thinking a lot about, different historical things and how that falls into generational memory because of what PJ and Abby have been talking about with conspiracy pilled. And
hmm
it's just one of those things that I wonder if they keep falling into the same kind of generational cycles and like bad patterns, because I don't know.
Well, God knew what we were like when he made
Yeah.
us. He knew what he made humans to be. And so the fact that we would fall into these patterns is certainly not a mystery to him. And by the same token, the whole generational memory thing, I don't remember where,
Mhm.
but it says that God punishes sin to the, was it fifth generation, seventh? I don't
I think
know.
it's seventh
But
because the seventh in the Bible
yeah,
means completion.
right. And that seems to me to be, I think that and generational memory probably play in together, but exactly how, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
It isn't something that I've put a whole lot of thought or study into, but it occurs to me it's probable.
that makes sense. Yeah. I think that sometimes our conscience can really, that word that's like, it calls us to account, but there's like a one word for that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but the word isn't in my head either.
yeah. I think
hmm
sometimes our conscience can do that to us when we engage in things that we should not be engaged in. And because of that, it can make it easier to fall away from following God. Because even though we know that He
Yeah,
is so merciful and so loving, and He just wants us to do what is best for us because He made us the way to do the things to sanctify Him that are going to be the best for us, that sometimes our conscience kind of punishes us. And when that happens, it's easy to fall away from going to church and doing the things and engaging in the spiritual traditions and such that,
yeah.
you know,
Well, I know exactly what you're saying. It's when you sin, the shame that you feel makes you want to turn away from God even more.
exactly.
Is that, yeah, I thought that was what you were
That's
getting at.
perfectly summed up.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I agree. Hmm.
Do you want me to read verse 44?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. The king also sent messengers with a decree to Jerusalem and all the towns of Judea, ordering the people to follow customs that were foreign to the country. He ordered them not to offer burnt offerings, grain offerings, or wine offerings in the temple, and commanded them to treat Sabbaths and festivals as ordinary workdays. They were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were even commanded to build pagan altars, temples, and shrines, and to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals there. They were forbidden to circumcise their sons and were required to make themselves ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the law which the Lord had given through Moses and would disobey all its commandments. The penalty for disobeying the king's decree was death. Oh, goodness gracious. So if you look at the footnote on verse 46, um,
hmm
to defile the temple and the holy things in it, or it also means to defile the priests. So
Okay.
there could have been some
Yeah.
abuse there, or there also could have been some like, I mean, today it would be called like ritual satanic like sexual abuse, but
Yeah.
back then they probably had different terms for it to the priests.
Well, and yeah, well, and I don't know. You know, I hate to speculate on that sort of thing because it isn't specific enough for me to even have an opinion, but it's totally probable because that's the MO that these other spiritual beings operate in. Doesn't seem to change much, does it?
I'm not trying to get like dark and gory, chat. That was the footnote and I found it interesting, and yeah. Anyways. So...
Fair enough.
Well, I'm not trying to talk about dark things on the internet when I'm trying to encourage people.
You know what occurred to me when we were reading that passage, the thing that jumped out at me was there's something actually here that's worth pulling out. It says, make themselves ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the law which the Lord had given through Moses and would disobey all its commands. Have you ever noticed that in life in general, in the world around you, that the further people get from a state of godliness, the more they actually seem to forget what it looks like. They seem to forget the good things. They seem to actually, it's like pulling a curtain down over their eyes or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
No, I definitely do. And I think part of it is just being so enmeshed in, I guess, like in regular daily life, and some of it's also because life is all about priorities, and when you prioritize God, good things happen.
Yeah.
And you're able to make really nice relationships. You're able to think, like, be refined. You're able to do all of these amazing things. And when you do the opposite, well, the opposite happens.
Surprise.
I mean, isn't that the first law of physics? Everything has an equal and opposite reaction?
Something like that, yeah.
I'm not a scientist. But yeah.
Close enough for these purposes.
No,
that sounds right.
And so it seemed like they definitely had a weighty decision to make. Either like follow the king and do all of the horrible things that they were taught not to do, or die. But when we have the kind of, I feel like a lot of, so the thing is, growing up, I actually knew this man. He was a great man. His name was Leopold. We had him at our house. He was a concentration camp survivor.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And they had told him that if he denounced his faith, that they would let him go. And if he did not denounce his faith, then he would have to work hard labor in, I forget exactly which concentration camp it was, but the others, kind of in the specific section of the camp he was in, they had a lot of choices like that, to either deny God or to die.
Yeah.
And he told the guards that if being faithful to God meant his death, that God could resurrect him.
Absolutely.
That God was all powerful and he wasn't going to bow down to any man. And growing up, that strengthened my faith so much, because of the fact that we have choices like that. They're not always at that level by any means, but we have choices where we either put God first and prioritize him, or we put other things first that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be putting first.
I actually think it is always at that level. It's just sometimes it's disguised, right? And in an eternal perspective, the decisions we make right now really are that important. It's just he had a much more fine edge put on it, but we have to make the same decisions every day, you and I do, and it's
Yeah.
easy. It's easy to fall into the wrong decision. In some ways, having it put to you that clearly it clarifies everything. It makes everything a lot more obvious.
Yeah.
Not that I want that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not asking for that, but
No, I think that chat definitely gets what you mean, and I definitely got what you mean. Because sometimes when we understand what the true choice is, we can make the true choice.
yep,
But sometimes when it's wrapped in pretty packaging or disguised as self-care or all of
yep,
the different trite things of the world, it's like, should I watch the football game? Well, the football game's on when I'm going to church. So, well, which is it?
yeah, I get the idea.
Yeah.
I do.
So,
Makes sense. Um,
but that's
see,
definitely an important takeaway from this.
you want to grab the next one, or you want me to?
I can grab, if you want, I can do 51 to 58.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. The king not only issued the same decree throughout his whole empire, but he also appointed officials to supervise the people and commanded each town in Judea to offer pagan sacrifices. Many of the Jews were ready to forsake the law and to obey these officials. They defiled the land with their evil, and their conduct forced all true Israelites to hide wherever they could. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, King Antiochus set up the awful horror on the temple. Sorry, I'm going to
You're
start back
good.
at 54. On
You're
the
good.
15th day of the month of Kislev in the year 145, King Antiochus set up the awful horror on the temple. The awful horror on the altar of the temple, and pagan altars were built in the towns throughout Judea. Pagan sacrifices were offered in front of houses and in the streets. Any books of the law which were found were torn up and burned, and anyone who was caught with a copy of the sacred books or who obeyed the law was put to death by order of the king. Month after month, these wicked people used their power against the Israelites caught in the towns.
Yeah. You know, what keeps coming back to me over and over again as we read through this is just how I'm trying to think how to put this into words. You've got two possibilities in your
Mhm.
worldview, and a lot of people in the modern world like to look at it as when we're free to do when we're free to do whatever we choose,
Mhm.
we would do good things. We would do this, we would do that. The common perception in the secular world of what freedom would look like is one thing, but the only time that happens is in a Christian culture.
Mhm.
Anytime the Christian culture goes away, you have this other pattern that comes back in, and it's like it doesn't seem to matter who the ruler is or what the nation is, or whether it's Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, Nazi Germany, whatever the nation, whatever the culture. When you kick God out on purpose, you end up with the same pattern of things. You end up with people being forced to do things that are against their conscience and killed or tortured if they don't, and a lot of people die for no particular reason. It's a pattern throughout history.
That is so true.
That's what it looks like to me
Yeah.
anyway.
Another just a quick side note.
Yeah.
Um Kislev is apparently a month which occurs in November through December.
Okay.
And it's also where Hanukkah is celebrated.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Just for some more context for the
Interesting.
Jewish side of things.
Gotcha. And
Um,
where was that mentioned?
that was
I'm
mentioned in.
missing it. Kislev. I see. 15th day of the month of Kislev. Got it.
Oh yes, 54. Thank you. Staring right at it. I was like,
Yeah.
wait, where is it?
Okay, so this would have been at a time when it was really not conducive because Israel's still in the northern hemisphere. This is sort of winter. This is not a great time to be out of your house.
Yeah.
That is interesting. All right. Well, shall I continue here then?
Yeah. I think it real quick. I think that's why in verse 58 where the Israelites caught in the towns, their houses are likely in these towns and they're not going out too much because of the fact that it's probably pretty cold and like a desert climate in the northern hemisphere. So I think that just makes it even harder.
Well, and it provides that context, right? It sort of shows you what's going on. Somebody who was reading this in Israel, who knew what the month of Kislev was, would go, "Oh, well, that's winter." Well, we don't know that.
Exactly. That's why I wanted to look it up because I'm like, if it's there, it probably is like a reason.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so verse 59. On the 25th of the month, these same evil people offered sacrifices on the pagan altar erected on top of the altar in the temple. Mothers who had allowed their babies to be circumcised were put to death in accordance with the king's decree. Their babies were hung around their necks, and their families and those who had circumcised them were put to death. But many people in Israel firmly resisted the king's decree and refused to eat food that was ritually unclean. They preferred to die rather than break the holy covenant and eat unclean food, and many did die. In his anger, God made Israel suffer terribly. Yeah, same pattern you see throughout the whole rest of the Old Testament, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting.
So
just thinking of this coming to visit us in this day and age, I can totally see it happening. You know, you look at how ready people were when COVID hit to just do whatever they were told, to essentially to just give up all of their freedoms for the sake of an imaginary threat.
Yeah.
It's really easy to see how something like this could come to be in our country. Absolutely. Without and that thought is just stomach turning. It's just scary. Anybody who has a family, yeah.
And you know, today it might not be that culture at large is telling us to circumcise or not circumcise our babies, but there is a huge push for abortion, and that, you know, that's also a type of sacrificing to idols, whether it be a woman doing that to sacrifice to kind of put ahead her her wealth, money, career, a lot of things like that. And it's so sad because, especially like you mentioned in COVID, there are a lot of people who don't like thinking. They just don't like thinking. And so when somebody tells them what to do, and I'm not saying this is the case of the Israelites, but in modern times, we can definitely see it, that when somebody tells them what to do and they give them directions, whether that's necessarily against their conscience or for their conscience, that they're ready and willing to give up constitutional rights, their own, you know, thoughts, their beliefs, their whatever, to see that through.
Well, and we don't really, how do I put this? We don't really conceptualize how strong social pressure is until it pushes us to do something that's really against anything we would have done up to that point. And that's sort of, yeah. And yeah, Nancy in chat, child sacrifice is practiced today through abortion. That's absolutely right. It is.
Yeah.
And we are seeing the same things resurfacing, but we also see with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, for example, we see a sort of a dividing. You know, when God judges, it isn't just a condemnation. That isn't God condemning, that's God judging. And the difference is, in a judgment, it's a dividing of the good from the bad. It's a separating. And we see this country, the US, being separated into pockets that are more or less evil or more or less good, in a way that we hadn't up until the year 2000 or just beyond. It's an interesting time we live in.
Exactly. I do find it hopeful, though, that in Iowa, there was a recent win for pro-life where I don't know if any of you guys in chat have seen this, but I get a newsletter because of the fact that I'm a live action ambassador. So I saw that they were able to decrease state funding from Planned Parenthoods, and that was such a good thing to say.
You know, the more we see stuff like that happen, something I heard somebody say that I thought was really interesting. He said, we ought to do what the blue states are doing in red states. We ought to make it so that people from blue states want to leave, that they want to go, you know, people with that mentality want to go to blue states, and people with a healthier mentality in blue states want to come to red states. For what it's worth, I think that's valid.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely see how that's going. I mean, we almost moved to Florida this past year, but some stuff ended up happening that made it so that unfortunately we were unable to, because we were going to be moving there with family, and then they moved there, and then they didn't end up staying because of certain non-political things.
Yeah.
They basically were from used to living in the woods, and then they lived in downtown Disney, and they were like, this is untenable. But
no, I celebrate every win I see for pro-life in this country. I noted some statistics this past month, something about 22,000 less abortions year over year than the previous period before Roe v. Wade was overturned. I mean, that's great. That's awesome.
Yeah. And speaking of, the pro-life side of things, anybody who wants to save some money on really great and delicious coffee, I highly recommend checking out North Arrow. Rob is a buddy of mine, and he does great work there. They are able to help donate to a lot of pregnancy centers and a lot of other amazing pro-life causes. So if you want to enjoy caffeine and support the stream, check out North Arrow and use code Freda for 10% off.
Or if you really want to, you could use code E6 for 10% off. Rob gave me one too, because I'm this book I'm doing, I'm going to be doing a podcast for it. So
that's awesome. Congratulations. I didn't know that.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's awesome. He actually helped me so much. He had no idea. It's awesome.
Rob is such a great guy. We adore him.
He's awesome.
That's fantastic. So speaking of other pro-life things, I am so excited to have fellow live action ambassador Sam. She goes by Pro-Life Sam on Twitter, on with me on Thursday evening. We'll be going live at 7 p.m. and hopefully you guys in the chat will come and take a look at that as well.
Awesome.
Okay, well, we were going to go for an hour, and we did. So one Maccabees stream down. Way to go, guys.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week, guys. God bless.